Thank you, that is very humbling. Before I start my talk, I'd like to say I feel so honoured that I've been chosen to receive the Eureka Democracy Award. To everyone at Eureka, thank you. I notice one of the past recipients of the award is Father Frank Brennan, a champion for those without a voice. His lifelong advocacy for the marginalised, the poor, the refugees and Indigenous people has in many ways made Australia a more just and humane society. It's hardly surprising he's been recognised as a living national treasure by the National Trust. In one sense, Father Brennan, who I think sees the big picture better than most, continues the struggle of the Eureka diggers who fought and died to bring about changes to the system. As an investigative business journalist, I see my role as shining a light in dark places where powerful individuals and institutions really don't want a light shone. It can be high stakes and sometimes high pressure, as they are powerful and have a lot to lose if the stories get out or get traction. To expose wrongdoing and defend the people who can't defend themselves is my key motivation, and it's what gets me up in the morning. Other journalists operate in this space, like Kate McClymont, a fearless lady who takes on some of the biggest crooks in the country, Joanne McCarthy, who exposed child sex abuse in the Catholic Church, the redoubtable Sarah Ferguson, who's not related to me, on the brutality of the live cattle trade, Richard Baker and Nick Mackenzie, who've exposed corruption and fraud. There are countless others who put their neck on the line every day. Journalists who take on these institutions often face legal action, intimidation, abuse and worse. It's no fun when it happens, but it goes with the job, and it wouldn't stop us from doing that job. My joint Fairfax and Four Corners exposés on the Commonwealth Bank, rampant wage fraud at 7-Eleven, gouging retirees in the retirement village industry, highlighted the clearest possible terms how some of the biggest corporations systematically exploit and rip off vulnerable customers and staff. Sadly, even when incontrovertible evidence was produced, many continued to dissemble. At the heart of the problem is a quest for more profit. We see change when a tidal wave of public opinion forces them to apologise and open up compensation schemes. It's a real shame it takes public exposure to do the right thing. When I heard the story of Tegan Cooper, whose father, Noel Stevens, was dying of pancreatic cancer and who spent the final 6 months of his life fighting for an insurance payout from CBA, I knew it had to be exposed. It was a David and Goliath battle, a dying man with $10,000 to his name taking on a multi-billion-dollar corporation in the courts, fighting for something that was rightfully his, a $220,000 insurance policy claim that he wanted to leave to his daughter. His testimony had to be taken in his rental accommodation as he was too sick to travel to the court. Pumping morphine into his veins to enable him endure the pain, he gave his evidence. It was confronting that CBA challenged his policy. Days before he died, he won the case, and the bank was told to pay out the insurance claim. But it didn't end there. As his daughter Tegan was arranging the funeral, she got a call from the lawyer saying the Commonwealth Bank was appealing the decision. Tegan fought the bank and won the appeal. But it demonstrated to me how far the so-called venerable institution, the Commonwealth Bank, was prepared to go to avoid payment, even if the legal costs were more than the actual claim. The driving force for exposing the wrongdoings at Commonwealth Bank was to help people like Noel Stevens, a scaffolder who'd worked hard all his life and who placed his trust and money in a bank only to have that trust betrayed in a cruel and heartless manner. It was to give a voice to Noel Stevens and others and expose the reprehensible, rapacious behaviour of the big end of town and see justice done. The Commonwealth Bank came onto my radar in 2013 when Jeff Morris, a former employee of the bank, turned whistleblower and approached me with documentary evidence of what was going on behind closed doors. Jeff had approached the regulator, ASIC, and he'd given them everything they needed to act. But nothing happened for 16 months. He quit his job, disillusioned with ASIC's response, and then he contacted me. Jeff told me about a boiler room culture that involved forgery, fraud, and a cover-up by management. He said the bank had allowed its financial advisors to rip off customers for the sake of bigger profits. They did this by putting people into high fee-paying, inappropriate bank products, such as a woman in her 90s who was sold high-risk products with an expected payout in 7 years. It also exposed a weak regulator. It was a story that resonated with thousands of people who had similarly been ripped off. It gave them a voice and it empowered others to stand up. And when the story came out, it also inspired other whistleblowers to come forward to expose wrongdoing in other banks. It triggered a Senate inquiry which recommended a Royal Commission. That was in 2014. CBA apologised, opened up a compensation scheme, but I wasn't convinced. The way the bank had reacted to the stories said a lot to me about the culture. It got very nasty with smear campaigns, meetings with senior executives, not me meeting them, but my bosses meeting them, all designed to stop more stories appearing, but the genie was out of the bottle. After that, there was a string of other scandals that erupted in the Commonwealth Bank, including the life insurance scandal, where another whistleblower, in 2016, Dr. Ben Coe, agreed to go on four corners to blow the lid on a culture of delay, deny and litigate. He showed how the bank was selling life insurance policies with decade-old definitions of heart attacks and rheumatoid arthritis that made it difficult for legitimate claims to be paid out. In other words, they were putting profit before people. When the stories first appeared, Commonwealth Bank pulled all the ads in Fairfax. They were worth millions of dollars. There were redundancies going on at Fairfax at the time, which made me feel absolutely dreadful. But the Labor Party, for the first time, decided after that story to back a Royal Commission. It was then that the lobbying really intensified. I was seen as anti-business, a bank basher, and many other derogatory names. Many in the media wrote about what a bad idea a Royal Commission was, a waste of money, you wouldn't find anything, you might even hurt the economy and our international reputation. In other words, I was irresponsible. What would I know? But it isn't just the banks that have needed the blowtorch. Wage fraud is another area where people, often foreign students on a visa, have been exploited. My first story on this was 7-Eleven, a franchise giant that was owned by a brother and a sister who'd become billionaires out of it. But behind their wealth was systemic wage fraud as franchisees struggled to make money, so screwed their workers. We spoke to many students who were working 60 or more hours a week for as little as $5 an hour in some cases. These students had no one to turn to and suffered in silence. They were afraid if they spoke out they would be deported for breaching their visa conditions. They were in a terrible catch-22 situation. A consumer advocate, Michael Fraser, who'd moved next door to a 7-Eleven store on the Gold Coast, contacted me after realising staff were being underpaid. He went to numerous stores and felt there was something that needed to be looked at. So I started to dig deep, and while working on the story at Four Corners, a whistleblower came forward with a database of documents that substantiated wage fraud was rife across 7-Eleven. Their own internal survey showed 69% of stores had payroll compliance issues. In fact, it was almost 99%. When the story went to air and was published in The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, people were absolutely outraged. To date, the company's paid $160 million in back pay to workers. The CEO left, the board was overhauled, and the company agreed to change the business model to try and make it fairer so that franchisees would stop ripping off workers. Then came stories on Caltex, Domino's, and Retail Food Group, which owns brands such as Brumby's, Gloria Jeans, Michelle's Patisserie and Crust Pizza. And that franchise sector currently faces a parliamentary inquiry with a report due next year, and some of the things that have come out are really shocking. Then there's the retirement village sector, which is another industry that really needs scrutiny. The government's got a Royal Commission into aged care, but it's really glossed over the retirement village sector. And in that, there are brutal business models which operate. It's largely unregulated, and so it allows people with questionable pasts to run them, including Berkeley Retirement Living, which was closed down at Christmas. It's a shocking thing to say, but some of our biggest corporations have systematically exploited and ripped off the weak and the vulnerable in the community. In the insatiable drive for bigger and bigger profits, the big end of town has lost its moral bearings, and the lives of too many Australians have been ruined. I've received so many emails from workers and former workers thanking me for giving them a voice. Knowing I've made a difference is such a good reward. I was at the Royal Commission into Banking this week in Sydney, and one man who'd been battling CBA's life insurance division came up to me and said thank you for actually saving his life. I looked at him perplexed, and he explained in 2016 he was suicidal. Then suddenly his life changed. He told me after watching the Four Corners story Money for Nothing on CBA and hearing other victims talk about the poor treatment, it made him realise he wasn't alone. He wasn't a fraud. You know, the bank had been spying on him, and his family started to think he was to blame. When the whistleblower Dr. Koh talked about the culture, it made this man feel he wasn't alone. It was an extraordinary thing to hear that a story can have such an impact at an individual level. It's hard to put into words the fulfilment I get from seeing laws change, compensation paid, and people empowered. But journalism can take a toll. There is always the constant threat of litigation and from some of the rich and powerful. In fact, on Wednesday, myself and a colleague and Fairfax got another writ from someone from Retail Food Group who is trying not to go to a parliamentary inquiry on Monday night. So he took the committee to the High Court yesterday and used the excuse because he is suing Fairfax, he shouldn't have to go. He actually filed that writ that morning. In 2012, just after I published the Gina Reinhardt, The Untold Story of the Richest Woman in the World, I was served with a subpoena by Gina's lawyers, demanding I hand over information that would expose confidential sources. As a journalist, I'd never do this, even though there was the very real possibility I could land in jail for contempt of court. The subpoena was eventually dismissed, but it hung over my head like a sword of Damocles and put a great strain on me and my family. There was many a sleepless night as Fairfax's lawyers worked to get it set aside. The whole period was surreal. Here was I fighting to keep my sources sacred, and the person who wanted them was a major shareholder in the company that was employing me as one of the senior writers. As Pam Williams, an investigative journalist, said at the time, it's a pretty remarkable situation for a media company's major shareholder to demand a journalist reveal their sources. This really is an inversion of everything that someone with a commitment to media should stand for. In 2013, a record number of subpoenas were served on journalists in Australia. I bagged 3 of them. Increasingly, journalists are being targeted with subpoenas to intimidate them to close down a particular issue or a piece of journalism. This tactic to use the courts as a weapon to suppress information really needs to be resisted at all costs. Information is the lifeblood of our democratic system. Sever this vital artery and the body politic of the nation and all the people who live in it will be the poorer. Besides the legal threats, it takes an emotional toll hearing stories day after day of people who've been done over by institutions. But I do my best and try and think of the highlights. A career highlight was the calling of the Royal Commission into banking after years of writing that we needed one. The nation has been shocked by some of the horror stories, such as CBA charging fees to dead people, senior executives at AMP caught lying to the regulator, and the list goes on. Commissioner Kenneth Haynes summed up the problem in his interim report. Too often the answer seems to be greed, the pursuit of short-term profit at the expense of basic standards of honesty. How else is charging continuing advice fees to the dead to be explained? The Royal Commission has been too quick, the budget too little, but it has laid bare the magnitude of institutionalised theft. Whether the final report due early next year translates into meaningful change, we'll just have to wait and see. I, meanwhile, will certainly continue to be watching and ready to report. Thank you.
Adele is happy to take questions, so who'd like to open the bag? Go there.
Adele, thank you so much for your speech. I found it absolutely riveting. I'm sure everybody else here did too. You spoke so much about the stress and the pressure that you were under when you were trying to expose all of the wrongdoings that were done. How much support did you receive from your employers and from the people around you? Because I imagine that would have been quite crucial to you having the impetus to go forward. Is that something?
Yeah, absolutely. When the Gina Reinhardt subpoena happened, my colleagues were just extraordinary. I couldn't have got through it without them. They rallied, they signed petitions that they sent to head office that the organisation support me, because it was a bit of a murky situation because it was a book, and was it the book? Because she was personally going after me, not Fairfax. So the subpoena was really to target me rather than Fairfax. But Fairfax stood behind me, which was, a big relief. It was, would have been very tough financially.
I'd like to ask a quick sort of topic of mine, which is the Murray-Darling Basin. So in terms of Murray-Darling Basin, which is Australia's food bowl, but also a great economic, tourism, environmental and domestic water supply area of this country, Australia being the driest continent on earth, have you ever thought of getting into the dilemma that's existed in the Murray-Darling between the irrigators and the people that depend on this great water system of this country?
I haven't, but I know that Linton Besser, who was a colleague at Four Corners, did a very good piece on that. I think it was last year. I'm not sure whether you saw it, but he has continued to write about that. He's recently moved across to London, but there is some journals that have been covering that. I've been sort of focusing on the banks for quite a while. Yeah.
Yes.
Michael, thank you very much for your talk. I worked for a time for a major resource company. I was fascinated by their long-term view. In terms of the banks, right now as they sit around thinking about the broad fish and so forth, do you think they're thinking, well, we're embarrassing now, or fidel now, a few apologies later, a bit of this, a bit of that, it'll all just be business as usual?
Yeah, it is a big fear, because that's what's happened in the past. I'm writing a book at the moment, and I'm going back to where did it all begin. And I've sort of started with deregulation of the financial markets, which we needed to have, but one of the problems was they didn't have a watchdog. They had a body called the NCSC, which had a budget of $5.8 million. And so you had all of these excesses like Bond and Scase, and banks were blowing up. We got a regulator, and it just seems that every time, the scandals happen, there's recommendations, and then the lobby groups get involved and they get diluted, because really at the heart of it is they don't want to change. You know, and I think, you know, hoping that a Royal Commission has really shocked them into doing something genuinely long-term instead of being so short-term focused on profit. But I'm not convinced as yet.
Will?
Adele, thank you for your speech. It was very inspiring. I guess sort of following on from the topic of the economy, as a woman, did you find it difficult to initially establish yourself as a respected journalist?
Well, I remember when I did first start in journalism at the Advertiser, I remember catching up with you know, different business people, and they'd say, I generally wear trousers a lot more than I wear dresses. And he said, why do you always wear trousers? Women should wear dresses. And, you know, do you really think you should go across to the stock exchange if you're wearing trousers? You know, and yeah, I remember an interview for a job. They said, how do we know if we hire you that you're not going to go off and have babies? So, yeah, there have been those sort of moments, you know, and, you know, Me Too moments as well over the years.
Yes.
Yeah, the question, I guess, is really the fourth estate, the future of the media, particularly considering what's happening in, say, the United States with Trump and so forth. And,
Would you speak up?
the future of the fourth estate and journalism, given what's happening with Trump in the USA and elsewhere, what chance is there for quality daily journals such as The Age to survive and also employ absolutely first-rate investigative journalists such as yourself? Where is that happening in the merger between Fairfax and Channel 9, and the future is looking a little bleak? So what's your view on that? And I hope it's...
So there's a few parts to that. So I'll start with Trump to begin with. He's actually been, in some weird way, great for journalism, because I remember, I think it was about 3 months after he was elected, the New York Times added some extraordinary number of subscribers. It's been hiring like there is no tomorrow journalists. So traditional media has done extremely well under Trump. We need Pauline Hanson here to be and then we'll do really well. But, you know, I'm still hopeful. You know, I'm at Fairfax. We're about to lose the name and become 9. I'm hopeful that through it all, journalism will live on, because journalists go into this job for a reason. They want to unveil the truth, and they're fearless people. And I think you can have all these obstacles, but it will always shine through. I think people are starting to realise that they have to pay for journalism, so we've been increasing subscriptions. And I think it's getting to a tipping point where, you know, it's being cut so much that we're going to start. I'm hopeful that we will see an upswing, because I know at The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, there's been a realisation that people want independent journalism and they want quality journalism. So they're trying to move away from the clickbait. And they're not printing, so, you know, even online, they're changing the amount of times that they're refreshing the website, so that it's more thought pieces.
Thank you.
Yes, stand back.
Yep, I've just got a question on your consideration of treatment of Catherine Livingstone versus Nicholas Moore. Is the Macquarie Bank that much better than the Commonwealth Bank, or
No,
is
it's
Catherine
not.
just last person standing at CBA?
Yeah, look, I don't think it's got anything to do with, you know, I think Catherine Livingstone did not come out well, and, you know, that's on her. It's got nothing to do with the Royal Commission. Macquarie Bank didn't appear the whole of this commission. Nicholas Moore appeared this week for 45 minutes. And that's part of it. I don't think it's got anything to do with gender. It's to do with the fact that this Royal Commission has been rushed. So you had 2 weeks on superannuation. It's a $1.7 trillion industry. It's crazy. You know, there's been a number of financial institutions, there's been parts of the sector that have been completely overlooked, and Macquarie is one of them. But there is a whole list of companies like that that have not been looked at, you know, the payday lenders, etc., etc., etc.
Sally.
Adele, what do you think we need to do to empower our regulators so that they can play a more proactive role in the future?
Oh yeah, because that is a huge problem. And I think if anyone was listening to the Royal Commission today, you would have realised what problems we have. When the new chairman, James Shipton, was giving testimony, and it was absolutely woeful, to be honest. And I think it just shows that it's entrenched culture of timidity. They are too scared to do anything. They, you know, whether it's captive regulation, there's a whole myriad of reasons why we've got what we've got, and we have it. They're anything but the tough cop on the beat. Part of it is they do need better resourcing. They need to have more law-type enforcement people in there. And they need to have a whole restructure. I think the structure of the regulator is not right.
Commensurate budget, perhaps.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
what would be cut.
When you're talking about time.
Yeah. Well, they just go seriously. I mean,
Yeah.
that's,
It is, yeah.
Hi Adele, I'm Trish and I've really appreciated tonight's speech. It's just been really inspiring. How do you keep doing what you do? Because it seems to me that the pressures are enormous and that sort of gets lost in what it is that you produce. So how do you keep doing what you do?
I really love my job.
Yeah?
I do, yeah. I think I'm in such a privileged role. And that's what makes me do it, because it's really fulfilling. You know, there is not many jobs where you can actually meet people, hear their stories, investigate, people trust you, and then you can write something or you can go on TV and then you can see the impact. It's really marvellous.
Thank you.
it's a great question.
Thanks, Adele. You've said a couple of things that are very interesting. First, the Royal Commission was rushed and fairly superficial. Secondly, we know there will be a federal election within 6 months. So what's your anticipation in terms of differences of policy and approach coming up to the election?
In terms of the Royal Commission, so the final report will be coming out in February. We're likely to have an election mid-May. So you would imagine what will have to happen is both parties will have to talk to this final report. I think the coalition will adopt whatever the recommendations are, and then it'll be, let's discuss it if they get re-elected, and we might see it watered down like we have in the past. I think if Labor is elected, what I think they will take is, they've been concerned it's a very short Royal Commission. They might want to have another mini Royal Commission, which is targeting a particular area. It could be having a look at the regulators, or I think they should look at compensation schemes, because I think that whole remediation is an area that hasn't really been properly looked at. But there are so many different areas that they could actually target as, we can't adopt this recommendation because we really need to have a more closer look. It's one of the things that the Labor Party has said is, there's been over 10,000 submissions, only 27 people have been able to get up and tell their story, which is crazy. You know, so there's many reasons why it's too short. You know, I'm not saying it can listen to all 10,000, but 27 is really disappointing.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Adele, for your insights. I wonder if you would accept that there might be a fundamental flaw in the Royal Commission process by having a Royal Commissioner who's a lawyer and not accompanied by economists who have some assessment of economic impact of regulation.
I think it would have been better if you had, say, 2 or 3 commissioners. You know, a lawyer, a consumer advocate, and an economist, you know, to get a good mix, because we are getting a very legalistic focused view. Even with the regulator, it's, you know, take legal action. Sometimes that's, you know, not commercially the right way to go. So I do agree with you.
Yes.
I echo everyone's sentiments. Amazing, thank you. What about the deterrence? Like the fines themselves seem
Yeah, that's right. And it's not just
realistic as
with
well.
it's not just with banks. It's even in terms of, you know, if you get done for wage fraud, it's peanuts. You know, the whole of the legislation is in place to beef up the fines, so that will help. But at the end of the day, you've got to change the culture, because, you know, the fines don't come out of their pockets. You've got to
Yes,
put
Barry?
heads on sticks. You know, there's got to be prison.
Yes, Adele, look, thanks very much for your
Sorry?
talk tonight. Thanks very much for the talk tonight. I was very enjoyed. We talk about, you know, giving more empowering the regulator and so forth. But doesn't it really get back to our politicians to give them the power?
Yeah.
When the politicians know exactly what should happen. And it's incumbent on the politicians. That's where it all...
I agree, but I think the regulators up to now have been very quiet. You know, if you look at what Alan Fells was like at the ACCC, he was always shouting to the rooftops about, he used the media and to actually get it across, he needed better powers, he needed more resources, and so it happened. The politicians might get whispers, hey, can you do this? But they're not going to do anything unless it's public. So I think it also depends on the regulator. They have to take ownership as well. And I agree that the politicians have actually really dragged their heels, because there was talk about beefing up the powers 4 years ago, and it's just sat there.
Okay, it looks like everybody's done. Would you please join me? Well, join me in we present our award winners with a little medallion which has got Peter Lawler's face on the front, a little depiction of the stockade. On the back it simply says Eureka Democracy Award 2018. A wonderful Australian, a fantastic presentation. It has been a great privilege to hear you tonight. Good luck, keep doing it.
Yeah.